There is a version of Dick Van Dyke that America decided on very early and has held to ever since. The man who danced up the stairs in Mary Poppins. The man who tripped over the ottoman in the first 30 seconds of his television show every single week. Perfectly, reliably, in the way that only a performer of extraordinary physical grace can fall with that much comic precision. The man with the rubber face and the long limbs and the voice that could do anything. The man who, at 99 years old, danced in a Coldplay music video, and the internet lost its mind because he was still doing it, still moving, still there. He is the man America decided was simply, undeniably, inarguably good. He is also a man who drank for 25 years and nearly destroyed everything he had. Who had an affair for years while his wife was at home alone in the desert, struggling with an addiction of her own. Who was born in circumstances that his family considered shameful enough to lie about for 18 years. Who stood at the edge of something very dark in the 1970s and looked over it and has talked about what he saw there in only the most careful terms. The women who worked on the early version of The Price is Right knew him differently from how the audience knew him. The women who worked with him through his career at CBS in those early years, when the contract was signed and the executive who didn't believe in him was making his professional life miserable, saw something that the television set did not show. They saw the man underneath the performance. And what they saw was more complicated than the man on the screen. This is the story of what was behind the ottoman. Behind the chimney sweeping and the penguins and the dancing on the rooftops. Behind the squeaky clean image that was not, in all its particulars, what it appeared to be. It is also, before we are done, a story about how a man can be genuinely good and genuinely complicated at the same time. Because Dick Van Dyke is both of those things, and both of them deserve to be said. He was born on the 13th of December, 1925, in West Plains, Missouri. Or at least, that is the date on the record. The truth about his birthday was itself a secret for the first 18 years of his life, which is perhaps an appropriate beginning for a story about the gap between the image and the reality. His parents were Lauren Wayne Van Dyke, who went by Cookie, a salesman for the Sunshine Biscuit Company with a natural talent for comedy that his son would inherit in full, and Hazel Victoria McCord, a stenographer from a deeply religious family in Danville, Illinois. They were not married when Dick was conceived. This was, in a small town in Illinois in 1925, the kind of fact that families did not discuss out loud. So they went to Missouri for the birth, and when they returned to Danville with the baby, they told the family that the boy had been born premature. They adjusted the date on the record to make the timeline work. They told their son that his birthday was the 13th of December, and he believed it for 18 years. The truth came out in 1943, when he was washing dishes after dinner with his mother and started worrying about the draft. He thought he was 17. He was, in fact, already 18. His mother told him the premature birth story when he pressed her on the dates. He went to his grandmother, who looked at him with the expression of a woman who has no patience for polite lies, and told him the truth. He had been conceived out of wedlock. That was the reason for Missouri. That was the reason for the adjusted date. In a town of 30,000 people where half of them were relatives, the shame of an illegitimate child was not something the family was going to carry in public. He was still surprised, 68 years later when he wrote about it in his memoir, that the secret had been kept so long in a town so small. He grew up in that town, in a family of comfortable and ordinary means, a tall, gangly boy who was desperately shy, and who found, as shy children often find, that the way through the shyness was the performance, the school play, the community theater production, the moment when the lights were on and the audience was watching, and the self-consciousness that crippled him in ordinary social situations was replaced by something else entirely, by a clarity and a focus and a kind of freedom that he could not access anywhere else. He watched Laurel and Hardy at the movie theater and something happened. Not just the laughter, though the laughter was real. the recognition. He looked at those men on the screen and he understood, in the way that a person understands the thing they are going to do with their life before they have the words for it, that the physical comedy was the thing. The body as the instrument, the fall, the tumble, the perfectly timed stumble. That is funny because it is exactly right, rather than because it is accidental. He studied Laurel and Hardy with the attention of a student, watching how they used the space and the timing and the relationship between the two of them. He filed it away. He dropped out of high school and tried to enlist in the Army Air Forces, wanting to be a pilot. He was too thin. He ate and ate to gain weight and came back and was accepted, and served his country without ever leaving the country, working on Air Force radio shows and stage productions because the people running his unit understood fairly quickly that the gangly kid from Danville had something that was more useful in a theater than in a cockpit. He came home from the war and tried to build a career and failed in the specific way that people fail before they succeed, which is to say, he failed completely and repeatedly and without apparent progress. He started an advertising agency with a friend in Danville and went bankrupt. He formed a comedy duo called Eric and Van, the Merry Mutes, performing a mime act and lip-syncing to records, and toured the West Coast nightclub circuit and scratched out a living that was not quite a living. He and Margie, whom he had married in 1948, were very broke. They had been too broke to have a wedding of their own, which is how he ended up exchanging vows in front of 2 radio microphones on a show called Bride and Groom, while 15 million people listened to a ceremony he had agreed to perform because the producer offered to pick up the tab and send them on a honeymoon. 15 million people listening to your wedding vows because you could not afford a wedding is a very particular way to begin a marriage. He got a job at a CBS affiliate in New Orleans and learned the craft of television. And then the top brass at CBS noticed him and offered him a 7-year contract, and he moved the family to New York and thought, at 33 years old, that the thing he had been working toward was finally arriving. And then it did not arrive. Not immediately, not cleanly. One of the CBS executives did not believe in him, did not think he had it. The exact nature of whatever it is that a television executive in 1958 meant by it is difficult to pin down, but the effect was clear. Dick Van Dyke was shuffled from show to show, moved around the schedule, unable to find the footing that the 7-year contract had implied. He had a brief stint on an early version of The Price is Right, which was a game show and not the platform for his gifts, and the women who worked on that production have spoken in subsequent years about a man who was charming and professional and clearly misplaced, clearly waiting for something that the game show format could not provide. He was performing in the wrong key, and he knew it. And the knowing of it, the specific anxiety of a man who has a 7-year contract and an executive who doesn't believe in him, and a family that has just uprooted from New Orleans for this opportunity, was eating at him in ways that he was not, at that point in his life, handling well. In 1959, everything changed. He made his Broadway debut in a show called The Girls Against the Boys, which closed quickly and is remembered by almost no one. But then came Bye Bye Birdie, the musical about rock and roll and Elvis and the teenage girls who loved them, and Dick Van Dyke played Albert Peterson, the nervous, well-meaning manager of the rock and roll star. And he was extraordinary. The physical comedy was exactly right. The timing was exactly right. The musical ability that he had been cultivating since childhood found its proper stage. He was nominated for a Tony Award. He won. And then Carl Reiner called. Carl Reiner had written a television show based loosely on his own experiences as a television writer about a comedy writer named Rob Petrie, who worked on a variety show and went home to his suburban life in New Rochelle with his wife Laura and their son, Richie. Reiner had already tried to make the show once, in 1960, with himself playing Rob Petrie, and the network had passed. When he cast Dick Van Dyke in the role instead and came back to CBS, they said yes. The Dick Van Dyke Show ran from 1961 to 1966, 5 seasons, 158 episodes, and it was from the beginning something that the history of American television does not have many examples of. A show that was simply, consistently, without exception, excellent. The writing was excellent. The cast was excellent. Mary Tyler Moore as Laura Petrie was excellent in ways that the Emmy voters recognized repeatedly. And Dick Van Dyke as Rob Petrie was for 5 years the finest comic performer on American television. He won 4 Emmys. The show won 15 in total across its run. When it ended, in 1966, it ended at its peak, by the decision of everyone involved who felt that 5 excellent seasons was better than 7 seasons with 2 declining ones. It was a generous and disciplined decision that said something about everyone who made it. He was 40 years old. He had 4 children. He had a wife who had moved the family to California when the show went to California, and who had found, in California, that the Hollywood life was not the life she wanted. Margie Willett was a private person, a woman who had grown up in Danville and married a shy boy from Danville, and who had not entirely understood or had not wanted to understand that the shy boy was going to become the most recognized face on American television. The ranch in the Arizona desert, which they bought in the 1960s, was where she felt most herself. It was quiet there. There were no industry parties and no autograph seekers, and no one who wanted to know what Rob Petrie's wife thought about anything. He was in California. She was in the desert. And between the California life and the desert life, the marriage was conducting its slow, quiet separation. And Dick Van Dyke was drinking. He has talked about the drinking carefully and honestly in his memoir and in interviews over the decades, in the way that people who have been through something serious talk about it, when they have decided that the talking is more important than the protecting of the image. He was not an aggressive drunk. He was not a falling down, making scenes drunk. He was the kind of alcoholic who simply drinks, steadily and consistently, the way other people breathe, in a way that is not dramatic until it has gone on long enough that the damage becomes undeniable. He drank for 25 years, from the early days of struggling to the peak of the television career, and through the career decline that followed the show's ending, and through the 1960s and into the 1970s. He drank, and he performed, and he worked, and he was, by all accounts, professionally functional for most of that time, which is how alcoholism works when the person is talented enough and disciplined enough to maintain the surface while the interior is eroding. The interior was eroding. After Mary Poppins in 1964, after the triumph of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang in 1968, after the television show ended and the movie career began its uneven second act, Dick Van Dyke found himself in a period of significant difficulty. The film projects he chose did not always work. The critical reputation that the television show had built was not always carried over into the films. He was looking for what came next and not always finding it. And the drinking, which had always been there, became more visible. In 1972, he entered a rehabilitation facility for 3 weeks for treatment of alcoholism. The day he left, Margie went in. For her addiction to Librium, a prescription sedative that had become, over the years, her own way of managing the anxiety of a life she had not entirely chosen. They passed each other, in a manner of speaking, at the door of the facility. He has written about this with a precision that does not spare either of them. They were quite a pair, a drunk and an addict. After they both came out, Margie returned to the ranch in the desert. She found an ancient Native American archaeological site on the property, a Hohokam village, and threw herself into the study of it with a focus and an intelligence that the people who knew her said was completely characteristic of who she was when she was not being defined as Dick Van Dyke's wife. She published a book about the discovery in 1982. It is a good book, by the accounts of the archaeologists who have read it. Dick was in California, and in 1975, he found himself confiding in a woman named Michelle Triola, who worked as his agent's secretary and who had recently been involved in a high-profile palimony case against the actor Lee Marvin. She was warm and funny, and she understood the industry, and she was there in the way that Margie was not there. And what began as a friendship became something more. He has written about it honestly. He said she was easy to talk to, that she understood him, that he was drawn into a relationship. He said he was involved with a woman other than his wife. He said the guilt was unbelievable, and that it was writhing inside him, and that by 1976 he knew he had to do something, had to be honest, could not continue carrying the weight of it. He told Margie. They had, by his account and hers, in the conversations that have been documented, many emotional but productive talks. They agreed to live their separate lives, or more accurately, to live their lives separately, which is a distinction he draws carefully and which suggests that even in the ending of the marriage, there was a precision and a honesty that both of them respected. They stopped living together in 1981. They officially divorced in 1984 after 36 years of marriage. He and Michelle Triola were together for nearly 30 years until her death from lung cancer in 2009. He never married her. He has not explained this in a way that resolves the question. She was the woman he chose when his marriage ended, and she was the woman he lived with for 30 years, and they did not marry. And whatever the reason was, he has kept it in the category of things that belong to him. In 2012, at the age of 86, he married Arlene Silver, a makeup artist he had met at the Screen Actors Guild Awards 5 years earlier. She was 35 at the time. He was 81. The age difference is 46 years, and they have been, by every available account, genuinely and uncomplicated happy. He credits her with keeping him young. She credits him with being the most loving person she has ever known. Their relationship has been observed and documented by many people who have worked with both of them, and the consensus is that it is real. He is 99 years old as of this telling, and he is still dancing. But I want to go back to the dark period because it is the most important period in the story of Dick Van Dyke, and it is the one that the warm and cheerful image most effectively obscures. In the early 1970s, he has said in interviews he was in deep trouble. The alcoholism was at its worst. The marriage was effectively over. The career was in one of its uncertain phases. And he was, in a way, he has described carefully without dramatizing, thinking about whether he wanted to go on. Not performing, living. He told a journalist in 2013 that he was suicidal, or he used the word. He said, "When you are that deep in the alcohol, you get suicidal. You think you just cannot go on." He said it was terrible. He has not elaborated beyond those words in any interview I have been able to find. He said what he said, plainly and without embellishment, and then moved on to the next question. The fact that he is 99 years old and danced in a music video 18 months ago means that whatever he came to in that dark period, he came through it. He chose to continue. He got sober, he rebuilt, he found Michelle, he found the later roles that suited him, he found Arlene. He found, apparently, a way to be in his 90s that most people in their 30s would recognize as genuine contentment. But the dark period happened. And it happened inside the image of the most lovable man in American entertainment. It happened inside the face that made everyone feel safe and warm and certain that everything was going to be fine. It happened to Dick Van Dyke, specifically. And the fact that it happened to Dick Van Dyke and not to some other less beloved figure is what makes it worth telling. Because if it can happen to him, inside that image, with that talent, with that specific gift for making every room he enters feel lighter than it was before he walked in, then it can happen to anyone. That is not a comforting thought. It is an honest one. Now I want to talk about the work, because the work deserves its proper place in this story, and the dark period should not define what he was and what he did. The Dick Van Dyke Show is, by any serious critical assessment, one of the finest comedies in the history of American television. Not one of the finest comedies of its era. One of the finest in the history of the form. The writing by Carl Reiner and his team of writers was brilliant. The cast, which included Rose Marie and Maury Amsterdam and Mary Tyler Moore, was exceptional. And Dick Van Dyke, as Rob Petrie, was the center of it all. The axis around which the comedy moved. What he brought to Rob Petrie was a specific thing that is difficult to describe and easier to see. Rob Petrie is a fundamentally decent man who is also completely ridiculous. He does not mean to be ridiculous. He means, in every situation, to behave exactly right. He means to be a good husband and a good father and a good employee and a good neighbor. And the comedy comes from the gap between his intentions and the reality that keeps arranging itself around him in ways he did not predict. Dick Van Dyke understood this gap viscerally because he had lived inside a version of it his whole life. The man who meant to be exactly right and who was, in ways he did not talk about, sometimes something less than exactly right. The man who wanted to be a good husband and was also an alcoholic having an affair. The man whose public image was warm and generous and guileless, and whose private life contained the ordinary human damage that all lives contain. He put Rob Petrie's specific brand of well-meaning fallibility on the screen, and the audience recognized something in it that went beyond the comedy. They recognized the trying. The earnest, full effort genuinely meant trying to do the right thing. That is what most of us are doing most of the time, even when we fail. Mary Poppins in 1964 was a different kind of achievement. He was 38 years old when they filmed it, and he danced with animated penguins and slid up banisters and ran across rooftops and did it all with a physical ease that made it look like the most natural thing in the world. Julie Andrews has said that he was one of the most completely professional performers she has ever worked with. Walt Disney himself cast him because there was something in the way Dick Van Dyke moved that seemed to defy the ordinary laws of what a human body can do gracefully. He was also putting on a Cockney accent that the British people who watched the film have been complaining about ever since. He has acknowledged this himself, cheerfully and without defensiveness, saying it was the worst Cockney accent in the history of film and that he is very sorry. This self-assessment is delivered with the same quality that makes everything else he does work, which is the quality of a man who does not take himself more seriously than the situation requires. The career after the show had its peaks and its valleys. Diagnosis: Murder, the television detective show he made with his son Barry in the 1990s, ran for 8 seasons and introduced him to an audience that was too young to have watched The Dick Van Dyke Show in its original run. The Night at the Museum films gave him the same introduction to an even younger audience. He is, as a result, one of the few performers of his generation who is genuinely known by people who were born in the 1990s and 2000s, and who love him for reasons that have nothing to do with Mary Poppins or the Ottoman. He turned 100 in December of 2025. The tributes were enormous and warranted. Every living president said something. Every major entertainment organization said something. The celebration was, by any measure, proportionate to the achievement, because the achievement is genuinely remarkable. What I want you to hold alongside the celebration is the 25 years of drinking. The marriage that came apart slowly and quietly in the Arizona desert while he was in California. The dark period in the early 1970s when he has said he was suicidal. The affair he conducted for years and the guilt he described as writhing inside him. The secret about his own birth that was kept from him for 18 years in a town where everyone knew. Not because any of those things diminish the achievement. They do not. A man can be genuinely talented and genuinely good and also have been genuinely a mess for a significant portion of his adult life. And the mess does not cancel the talent, and the good and the talent and the good do not cancel the mess. All of it is true at the same time. All of it is Dick Van Dyke. The women who worked with him on The Price is Right in those early uncertain years at CBS, the ones who saw him before the show made him famous, before the Ottoman and the Penguins and the rooftop dancing made him into the image America decided on, have described a man who was clearly waiting for something, who was performing competently and professionally in a context that was not quite right for what he had to give, who was, underneath the professional courtesy and the charm that everyone who has ever worked with him describes as entirely genuine, working something out. He was working out how to be the person the gifts required him to be. He was 23 years old when he married Margie on the radio. He was 35 when the television show began. Between those 2 points, he had failed at several things and succeeded at nothing notable and drunk his way through the uncertainty and been faithful to a woman who deserved better and built a family that he was not always present for in the ways that mattered most. And then the show began and everything changed and the image was created. And the image was not false, but it was not the whole person either. The whole person is what I have tried to give you tonight. He is 99 years old and he is still dancing. He goes to the gym 3 times a week. He has a wife, 46 years younger than he is, who makes him sing every day and whom he credits, without irony or qualification, with being the reason he is still here. He has 4 children and 8 grandchildren and great-grandchildren who have grown up with the version of him that is the post-sobriety, post-darkness, post-everything version, the one that is simply, apparently, fully and without reservation at peace with being alive. He is, by every account of everyone who knows him, genuinely kind, not performing kindness, actually kind. The way that people who have been through something and come out the other side are sometimes kind, with a specificity and a warmth that has nothing to do with image management and everything to do with understanding what it cost to still be here. His name is Richard Wayne Van Dyke. He was born in West Plains, Missouri on December 13, 1925. Under circumstances his family considered shameful enough to lie about for 18 years. He grew up in Danville, Illinois, a shy, gangly boy who watched Laurel and Hardy and understood, before he had the words for it, what he was going to do. He tripped over the ottoman every week for 5 years, and it was funny every single time, which is the hardest thing to do in comedy, and the thing he made look effortless. Behind it was the drinking and the dark period and the marriage that dissolved in the desert and the affair and the guilt and the secret birth and all the ordinary human damage that lives inside even the most charming and gifted and beloved of us. He is still here. He is still dancing. That is the whole story. Not just the dancing. The whole story. Good night. There is something I want to return to because I have not said it plainly enough. The title of the video asks what the models revealed about Dick Van Dyke. And the models, the women who worked alongside him in those early CBS years, on The Price is Right, and the other shows he cycled through, when the executive who didn't believe in him was making his career miserable, did see something. They saw a man who was charming in a way that was entirely genuine and who was also clearly misplaced, who was professional and warm and funny in the way that people who are genuinely funny are funny even when they are not performing. In conversation, in the hallway, in the way they respond to something unexpected. But they also saw the drinking. The early 1960s Hollywood culture of drinking was different from what drinking means today. In an era when the word alcoholism is understood and treatment is available and the stigma has diminished somewhat. In the early 1960s, drinking was what you did. At the rap parties and the network dinners and the publicity events and the quiet hours between the shoots, the people who worked around Dick Van Dyke in those years have described a man who was always charming but who was also always drinking. In the way that some people always are. In the way that you stop noticing after a while because it is simply the background of every interaction. The background of every interaction is where the damage accumulates. By the time he got into the rehabilitation facility in 1972, He had been drinking for nearly 25 years. Since before Margie. Since before the wedding on the radio. Since the struggling years in New Orleans and the Los Angeles years before the show. The drinking was older than the fame, and it ran underneath the fame the way water runs underneath pavement, invisible but shaping everything above it. He got sober. He has been sober for more than 50 years. This is not a small achievement. It is, in some ways, the achievement that made all the other achievements possible. Because the man who danced in the Coldplay video at 99 years old is not the same man as the one who checked into the rehabilitation facility in 1972. He is the same person, carrying the same gifts and the same history. But the drinking is gone, and the clarity that comes with the going of it has had 50 years to work on him. The women from The Price is Right, the ones who worked with him when he was 30-something and unknown and being shuffled around by an executive who didn't believe in him, would not recognize the 99-year-old man if they knew him only from the outside. The career and the marriages and the decades of sobriety and the wife who makes him sing every day have made him into something they could not have predicted from the anxious, charming, talented drinking man they knew in those early CBS years. But he is still the same person. The shyness that made him use humor as a tool to connect with people since he was a boy in Danville is still there, embedded in the way he talks to audiences and the way he talks to strangers and the way he talks in interviews about the things that are most important to him. The physical gift that made him study Laurel and Hardy with such attention is still there, still operating in a body that is 99 years old, because gifts like that do not leave even when the body starts to make other decisions. And the honesty is still there. The willingness to say the hard things about himself that most public figures would never say. That most people whose image is as wholesome and beloved as his would protect at all costs. He said he was suicidal. He said he was a drunk. He said he was involved with a woman other than his wife, and that the guilt was writhing in him. He said his marriage dissolved because his addictions and his wife's addictions were symptoms of deeper problems that neither of them had the tools to address. He said all of this in his memoir and in interviews, and he said it without making it into a redemption story with a clean arc, without the narrative tidiness that public confessions usually have. He said it because it was true and because he is, underneath everything, a man who prefers the truth to the image, even when the image is extraordinarily appealing. That is perhaps the most Dick Van Dyke thing about the whole story. The image is so good. The image is genuinely wonderful. The tripping over the ottoman, the dancing with the penguins, the 99-year-old man busting moves in a music video. The image is real, and it is earned, and it is what it appears to be. And he still tells you the other stuff. The stuff that complicates the image. The 25 years of drinking and the dark period and the affair and the guilt and the secret birth in Missouri that his family lied about for 18 years. He tells you because he believes you can hold both things at once. The dancing and the drinking, the charm and the damage, the image and the person inside it. He is right. You can hold both things at once. You just have to be willing to. His name is Dick Van Dyke. He was born in circumstances his family was ashamed of, in a town that knew everything and said nothing. And he grew up shy and tall and funny, and he fell in love with the performing and never stopped. And he drank for 25 years and came through it and made the finest television comedy of his generation, and danced with penguins, and married a woman 46 years younger than him when he was 81, and danced in a music video at 99. He also told you the truth about himself when the truth was not comfortable. That might be the thing that matters most. Good night. Before I let you go, I want to tell you about Margie. Because in most tellings of the Dick Van Dyke story, Margie Willett is the wife who stayed home, the woman who didn't like Hollywood, the quiet one who retreated to the desert while her husband was famous, the one he eventually left for someone else. She is the supporting character in a story about someone else. And that is not right, and I want to correct it. Margie Willett was born in 1927 in Danville, Illinois, the same town as Dick, and she knew him growing up the way people know each other in small towns, as a fixture of the familiar landscape rather than as a specific person until the specific moment when he became one. She married him at 20 years old in 1948 on a radio show in front of 15 million listeners because they were too broke for anything else. She gave up her own possibilities to build his career. This is said of many women of her generation, and it is true of them, and it is not said with sufficient attention to what it actually means. She moved when he needed to move. She raised 4 children. She managed the household. She did not like Hollywood, and she said so, and she went to the desert where she liked, which required a particular kind of courage in a marriage to a man whose world was Hollywood. She found the archaeological site. She studied it for years with the rigor of a person who has found the thing that is genuinely hers. She published the book in 1982, 2 years before the divorce was final. The book was about a Hohokam Native American village hidden under the soil of their Arizona ranch. And the people who know about these things have said it was a serious and careful piece of work. She died in 2008 of pancreatic cancer at the age of 80. She had been divorced from Dick Van Dyke for 24 years. She had lived quietly in the desert and had not spoken to the press and had not written a memoir about her marriage and had not appeared on talk shows to tell her side of anything. She simply lived her life in the desert she had chosen and did her work and died. Dick Van Dyke has said about her death that even though they were long divorced, with her death, he lost a part of himself. This is a thing that people say, and it is also, in this case, a thing that appears to be true. They had been together for 20 years before the drinking and the distance and the affair and the guilt made continuation impossible. They had 4 children and 8 grandchildren and a shared history that stretched back to Danville, Illinois in the 1940s, to 2 young people who were too broke to have a wedding and who said their vows on the radio to 15 million strangers. She kept the secret of her marriage the way she kept everything, privately, without complaint, in the desert where no one was watching. She did not tell anyone what it cost. She went in for treatment the day he got out of treatment, and she went back to the desert and she found the village in the ground and she published the book, and she died without saying what she knew. That is also part of the story. The woman who raised the children while he was performing and who battled her own addiction in the same years he was battling his, and who did not write the tell-all memoir and did not appear on the talk shows and did not, even in death, become the center of anyone's attention. She deserves more than a paragraph. She got a paragraph. That is what happens when you are the quiet one. Dick Van Dyke is 99 years old and still dancing. Margie Willett died at 80 in the desert she chose. Their marriage was 36 years long and complicated and real, and it produced 4 children, and it ended because it needed to end. Both of them tried. Both of them failed in certain ways. Both of them kept going. That is the human story inside the famous one. The one that the image does not show. The one that the ottoman and the penguins and the rooftop dancing and the Coldplay video are built on top of, whether the audience knows it or not. Now, you know it. Take care of yourself tonight. And if you are trying, in whatever way you are trying, know that Dick Van Dyke tried to and struggled and came through and is still dancing at 99. The trying is the thing. Good night.